What is happening, guys? We got another UFC card this weekend. Main event, Sean Brady taking on Gilbert Burns. And I love this card. This is going to be a banger of a card. I've been excited to break it down for a couple of reasons. First, there was no card last week. And then the week before that, I was away on vacation for my birthday. So haven't done a video in a few weeks. The last one I did was the Dricus du Plessis fight taking on Israel Adesanya, and did a giveaway for that card. It was whoever could guess the winner of the fight and the amount of fantasy points they would score. Whoever was closest, going to get a free sub to our MMA tools. And the winner is Patness Picks, who was within like fractions of a fantasy point away from getting the answer exactly. So Patness, DM me on Twitter and I'll get you hooked up with a free sub. Also, recording this, it is during week 1 of the NFL season. We've got a promo going on our site. If you want access to our NFL data and tools, it is just $1 with the promo code kickoff. There's going to be a link for that down below in the YouTube description box. So our player projections, our ownership projections, our simulations, our single lineup sim that we have now, so you can hand build a lineup and simulate that as well. You get access to all of that for just $1 as part of our core package, promo code kickoff. So if you want to sign up for that, if you're playing NFL DFS this weekend, it's just $1. It's a great value. Link for that down below. But let's get into talking about this card. And if you guys haven't done it, like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And yeah, like I said there in the intro, there's going to be a lot of great fights on this card, especially a lot of great action fights. So there are a handful of individual fights that I want to be heavily exposed to for this card. One of them is the main event, Gilbert Burns against Sean Brady. And every single Gilbert Burns fight typically is really fun to watch and scores well from a DFS perspective as well. The concern I have about Gilbert Burns at this point, it's got to be the age. He's 38 years old. He's taken a ton of damage as well. So if you look at some of the recent fights that we've seen from Gilbert Burns, he was looking great against Jack Della Maddalena. And then what happens? He gets caught and finished in the 3rd round of that fight. Before that, he gets the crap beat out of him by Belal Muhammad. Also a fight where Gilbert Burns got injured, so he was fighting very limited. So the last time we saw him with a meaningful win, I mean, Neil Magny, I guess, although Neil Magny isn't exactly a top contender at this point, who he had the win over Jorge Masvidal, but that was a retirement fight. He had the competitive fight against Khamzat Chimaev, but also one where he didn't end up winning, and Gilbert Burns also got hurt and dropped at one point during that fight. So I guess the last meaningful win he had was against Wonderboy Thompson all the way back in July of 2021. So we're looking 3+ years ago. And to me, Sean Brady is somebody who I think the public is soured on a little bit, but it's because he lost to Belal Muhammad, and the public just doesn't really like Belal Muhammad. But Belal Muhammad, now the champion of the division, like, how much are we going to knock Sean Brady for being a 16-1 fighter who's looked pretty dominant throughout most of his UFC career? And his lone loss came in a finish loss against Belal Muhammad. So bounced back really well, looked great to me in the win over Kelvin Gastelum. A few years ago, I would have picked Gilbert Burns to win in this matchup, but considering the age of Gilbert Burns, the fact that he's also looked to be a little bit of a diminished version of himself in recent fights, I'm going with Sean Brady to win. The matchup could get a little bit weird if Sean Brady doesn't look to shoot takedowns, but I do think that Sean Brady is going to be able to land takedowns in this matchup, particularly because Gilbert Burns is such a good grappler that he's okay with fighting off his back. And in his own right, also, Sean Brady is a great grappler. And in MMA grappling, I don't think there's that much risk of Sean Brady being submitted when Gilbert Burns is on his back. So going to pick Sean Brady to win. I think he is going to look to shoot the takedowns, and I do think he's going to be able to hold a lot of top control time. And I think that Gilbert Burns is going to accept those takedowns. So I think Brady wins. I think he also scores really well from a DFS standpoint. He's going to be popular. We haven't projected around 40% projected ownership, but I'm overweight to that mark. Currently have Sean Brady as my most rostered fighter on the entire card. I have some exposure to Gilbert Burns on the other side as well, around 30%. But if you're playing one lineup, Sean Brady is definitely my preferred way to go in the main event. Co-main event, we are going to have another pretty fun matchup. Jessica Andrade taking on Natalia Silva. Silva, one of the best prospects that we have in the flyweight division. And this is a massive step up in competition for her. And I think the line is a little bit too wide. At the time of recording this, we currently have Jessica Andrade, nearly a plus 300 underdog. The widest line, she's plus 277. That's at SXBet. And then there's other books as well, like Bovada, Bet Online, that have her plus 265. She's also plus 265 at DraftKings at the time that I'm recording this. And I do think that Natalia Silva probably a little bit more likely to win. She has good takedown defense. She's also a very clean striker. She's much more technical than Jessica Andrade. You could certainly see Andrade getting clipped as she really aggressively looks to close the distance and shoot takedowns. That's kind of what ended up playing out in the matchup that Jessica Andrade had against Yan Xiaonan, where she really recklessly was moving forward, got caught, knocked out coming in. That's one of the possible outcomes for this fight. But I still think that Jessica Andrade is much more live to win this fight than what the betting odds indicate. And considering that Andrade has always been an excellent DraftKings scorer because the output's really high, both in terms of the striking and the wrestling. You look at Andrade, she lands 6.62 significant strikes per minute. She lands 2.37 takedowns per 15 minutes. She's also a potent finisher. So pretty much whenever Andrade wins, you're typically looking at a massive DraftKings score. And when you consider the price on Andrade and the fact as well that, like I said, I think the betting line is a little bit too wide. Andrade is one of my favorite punt plays on the slate. We have her projected for sub 20% ownership at $7,200. I'm going to be taking shots on her for sure. Natalia Silva is kind of getting squeezed out of my lineups on the high end, not because I don't think she has potential to score well, but rather because I think that she is not as likely to win as some of the other pay-up options. And there are a lot of pay-up options that are really appealing to me on this slate. So I'm going to pick Silva to win by decision, but despite that, Jessica Andrade is by far my preferred DFS way to play the co-main event. Moving on to the next fight here, Steve Garcia against Kyle Nelson. This should also be a pretty fun fight. There was a stretch of fights where Kyle Nelson, well, it's kind of gone two ways because when Kyle Nelson first broke into the UFC, he had a lot of really fun fights. The Diego Ferreira fight, really fun. The Matt Sales fight, also really fun. The Marco Polo Reyes fight, that was one that lasted just a minute. They went to war, and then Kyle Nelson ends up getting a knockout. Then we also saw Kyle Nelson get finished by Billy Quarantillo. And then what we started to see happen is Kyle Nelson had these fights where he looked great great might be an overstatement. He looked decent in the first round. It had fun, competitive fights. And then he would just be gassed out and you would have nothing left by the time the end of the second round or the third round came along. And what he decided was the counter for this was just to do nothing in some of his fights. So the fight against Jai Herbert, nothing happens. The fight against Doo Ho Choi, pretty much nothing happens. The fight against Blake Builder, pretty much nothing happens. Same in the fight against Fernando Padilla. But his last fight against Bill Algeo, we kind of saw more of the Kyle Nelson of old. He was aggressive. Bill Algeo was aggressive. It ended up being a pretty fun fight where it was a controversial stoppage, but still, Kyle Nelson was a big underdog, and he comes through with a big DraftKings score by getting a finish in the first round over Bill Algeo. Now he's fighting Steve Garcia, and I don't know it's possible to have a bad Steve Garcia fight. He is uber aggressive. He is somebody who has big power, and he is no chin himself either. So if you look at Steve Garcia's fights, he's knocking people down. He's getting knocked down himself. Last fight against Sungwoo Choi, you get the knockout for Steve Garcia in just about a minute. Before that, he fights Mel Costa. He knocks out Mel Costa in the second round. Before that, he fights Shailin Nurdanbeke and gets the finish in the second round, but they both knock each other down. He knocks down Chase Hooper 3 times. Against Mahashate, he gets finished in a minute and gets knocked down twice. So you just see what happens here. In pretty much all of these Steve Garcia fights, there's at least one, if not multiple, knockdowns. You have to go all the way back to February of 2020. So 4.5 years ago, since there was a Steve Garcia fight where there was no knockdown on either side of the fight. So I think this should be a war. I think the winner should score really well. Because I don't trust the cardio of Kyle Nelson, I'm going to lean more towards the Steve Garcia side. Garcia is also going to be fairly popular. We've got him projected for 36% ownership. So I'm a little bit overweight to the field on Steve Garcia, but still overweight to the field on Kyle Nelson on the other side as well. I think this is a really great fight to target. I think somebody's getting knocked out. I think it's probably going to be Kyle Nelson in the second or third round as he starts to fatigue, but I want to be overweight to both sides of this fight. Moving on here, we have Matt Schnell taking on Cody Durden, and I think Matt Schnell is really good. The problem is that he's got no durability. So you see constantly Matt Schnell is somebody who looking good in a competitive fight. No, he's been knocked out. He's unconscious. He's sleeping on the canvas. And that was what happened in his last fight against Steve Erceg. First round, fairly competitive. Second round, Steve Erceg knocks out Matt Schnell. Against Mateusz Nicolau. First round, fairly competitive. Second round, he's dead. Fight before that against Sumidarji. This was actually one where the inverse happened, where it looked like Matt Schnell was about to die, and then all of a sudden he had an epic comeback, ends up submitting Sumidarji in that fight. But either way, lots of back and forth fights that end up happening with Matt Schnell. His durability, the biggest concern. And considering now that we've seen him knocked out, let's see, 2 fights in a row. He's taken not that much time off either. He fought Steve Erceg just back in March, and he's coming back from what was a really vicious KO. I think what ends up happening is kind of the same story as a lot of other Matt Schnell fights. I think it's going to be competitive until it isn't. And I think Cody Durden is going to end up knocking out Matt Schnell in this matchup. So Cody Durden, he is my preferred way to play this fight. The one sticking point on Cody Durden is he is $9,400 in a matchup where he's a big favorite over Matt Schnell. So the price point is maybe a little bit difficult to get to. The one thing that does get him into some of my lineups, though, or at least more than I thought I was going to get him to, is he's not crazy popular at 23% projected ownership. So I'm coming in a little bit overweight to the field on Cody Durden. But when we talk about him in a little bit, my real preferred pay-up option when I can get to him is Isaac Dulgarian at $9,900. So if you have the salary to spend up for anybody, I'm going to say Dulgarian is the guy. But Cody Durden also a viable spend-up option for this slate. Another great fight to target here. Trevor Peek against Yanal Ashmouz. Every single Trevor Peek fight is weird as shit. Fun stuff happens. It's sloppy. Trevor Peek is a very good fan-friendly fighter. I think that's the best way to put it. He throws out all kinds of weird techniques. He's throwing standing hammer fist. He's throwing spinning shit. And he's got good cardio and crazy durability as well. If you just watched him, be like, oh, this guy's terrible, because the technique is so bad. He's doing weird things you never see from other fighters, but he never slows down. He never stops being aggressive. He never gives up on himself, and it creates for a lot of fun fights. And, Ashmouz on the other side of the fight, he's also somebody who has big power and is capable of putting on entertaining fights. We saw in his matchup against Sam Patterson, where he was a fairly significant underdog, we saw that power come into play, caught the chin of Sam Patterson, knocks him out about a minute into that fight. So I do think that this is going to be more output on the Trevor Peek side and then bigger power, the more damaging shots coming from Yanal Ashmouz. So I think it's going to be a very close competitive fight. There's going to be a ton of output. I don't know exactly which way to go in terms of a lean to pick the fight. I'm going to lean a little bit more towards Ashmouz for DFS purposes, just because we always see Trevor Peek being a fan favorite. He ends up seeing his ownership get a little bit steamed up as we get closer to lock. So I'm going to go with Ashmouz in what I think should be a really fun competitive fight where the field is going to be a little bit higher on the Trevor Peek side. But once again, I plan on being overweight to both sides of this fight in the mid-range. But if you're building a single entry lineup, I think there's good leverage to be had on the Ashmouz side, because I do think we're going to see a pretty popular Trevor Peek. Moving on for the next fight, it is Rongzhu taking on Chris Padilla. And this is a fight that I don't have as much interest in, considering that there are a handful of fights I've already talked about. I love targeting. I can't be targeting everybody. I can't have 70% exposure to every single fighter on the card. And Rongzhu against Chris Padilla. When it comes to Rongzhu, he is somebody who has pretty good output, lands 5.47 significant strikes per minute, 2.09 takedowns per 15 minutes. But keep in mind that a lot of this data is come from his road to the UFC fights, where he's fighting very low-level competition. Because if you do look at Rongzhu before this, he was somebody who fought in the UFC, got cut, ends up coming back through the road to the UFC, and then ends up winning the series, gets back into the UFC. But he had a loss to Kajula Vargas, which is a really bad loss. Vargas is not somebody who I consider UFC caliber. He beats Brandon Jenkins, but once again, Jenkins, not somebody I consider to be UFC caliber. Then he fights Ignacio Bahamondes, gets submitted, and no real shame in that. Bahamondes is a real legitimate prospect. But the loss to Vargas really sticks with me as one where it's like, I don't consider that Rongzhu is a very high-level MMA fighter. I don't think he belongs in the UFC. And on the Chris Padilla side, I'm not sure that he's a UFC caliber fighter either. I know that he looked pretty good in his UFC debut against James Lontop, and he was a really significant underdog in the matchup. He was something like, what was it? I'll pull up the numbers right here, but plus 220 or something like that. And he ended up having a really surprising submission win. He was able to land 3 takedowns in that fight before getting a rear naked choke right at the end of the first round. The problem I have here, though, is Chris Padilla, while we did see him just crazy aggressive hunting takedowns in that matchup, we have seen Rongzhu is pretty good takedown defense, defending at an 85% clip. So I think ends up happening here is I think that we're going to see Padilla really aggressively hunt for takedowns, might struggle to get them, could see a lot of stalling up against the fence. And I do think this fight probably ends up going to decision with Rongzhu end up winning. Other fighters that I want to be targeting, he's also pretty expensive. He is, $8,900? Let's see. Rongzhu, where is he? Yeah, we've got him. Yeah, also 32% projected ownership at $8,900. That's another thing to consider is we have him expected to be somewhat popular for this slate. So one of the fights that I'm not going to be looking to get all that much exposure to, especially not relative to the field. Next fight, Isaac Dulgarian against Brendan Marotte. And pretty simple fight here. We just have an insane betting line here. It's so crazy to the point where I first looked at it and thought, oh, this must be a mistake that somebody's listed as a minus 3,500 favorite. And that's where we're at right now. We've got the line on Isaac. Actually, listen to this. SXBet has Dulgarian as a minus 7,900 favorite. I've never seen a number ever like that in any MMA fight. And I think this is a squash match. I think that Dulgarian is going to win this fight really however he wants. And he is a very, very DraftKings friendly score in his wins pretty much always. Because if you look at Dulgarian, he's a potent finisher. He's aggressive with the takedowns. He is also really aggressive with ground and pound, always hunting for those finishes. He lands over 6 takedowns per 15 minutes. He lands nearly 3 significant strikes per minute. The only reason that mark isn't higher is because oftentimes we see the UFC stats count ground and pound as just strikes and not significant strikes. So this doesn't even do justice to the amount of output that you see from Isaac Dulgarian. And then Brandon Marotte on the other side, he is just not somebody who belongs in the UFC at all. We've seen him fight once. He fought Terrence McKinney on short notice and just instantly got KO'd in that matchup. So I think that's what we see happen here as well. I think Isaac Dulgarian takes him down, submits him, ground and pounds, finishes him however the hell he wants. Maybe does it in the first minute and gets the quick win bonus. The only sticking point that we have here on Isaac Dulgarian, $9,900. So really, really expensive price point. I'm going to do everything I can to get Dulgarian into my lineups because I really do think that he's a safe bet to win and score a ton of fantasy points. It just is ultimately going to come down to how easily am I going to be able to pay up for his salary, and am I going to be doing it in a way where I'm creating somewhat unique lineups. But if you could play Dulgarian and the salary isn't a concern in an individual lineup you're building, you want to play Dulgarian in that lineup. And by the way, zero reason, even not for contrarian reasons, don't take any shots on Marotte this weekend. He's not going to win. And he's going to score, he's more likely to score 0 fantasy points than he is to win. I don't know if that's a hot take, but that's where I stand on it. Felipe Dos Santos taking on Andre Lima. And I'm not super high on either of these guys at this point. After Felipe Dos Santos made his UFC debut against Manel Kape, I thought, oh, this guy is a legit prospect. He looked great taking that fight on short notice. Also, massive, massive step up in competition for him. Makes his UFC debut fighting on a pay-per-view and against a highly ranked opponent, Manel Kape, who at the time was like, a couple of fights away from a title shot. So while he did lose, it was a fight of the night, and it was super, super competitive as well. Not that there was an argument for Dos Santos winning, but it was a competitive and really fun fight. So then he goes and fights a big step down in competition in Victor Altamirano, and a lot of people, myself included, thought, hey, this is a great way for Dos Santos to get his first UFC win after what he showed against Manel Kape. Now, he got the win, but it was a very, very close fight and also very controversial fight. A lot of people thought Altamirano won that fight, but the thing that really concerns me coming out of that, Dos Santos had no ability to defend takedowns. Victor Altamirano, who's not, this isn't a Division I wrestler or anything like that, lands 9 of 11 takedowns against Felipe Dos Santos and really just faced 0 resistance at all in that matchup. So that's what has to concern you going forward with Felipe Dos Santos is other fighters are going to look at that and they have to think, I shoot takedowns against this guy, I win the fight in all likelihood. But now Andre Lima is somebody who I don't know that he has the highest fight IQ at all. He fought Mitch Raposo in his last fight. He is destroying Mitch Raposo. It is not remotely competitive, but destroying in terms of like skill set, in terms of the actual fight, it ends up being a split decision because Andre Lima just doesn't do anything. He's got massive advantages on the feet. He hurts Mitch Raposo multiple times and just doesn't do anything. So you watch the fight and you go, Andre Lima should have been a massive favorite in that fight. and was clearly the better fighter of the two. He just didn't do a ton. Then you have the fight against Igor Severino, which was a super weird fight. It ends up ending in a DQ because Severino ends up biting Andre Lima, but there was every foul imaginable on both sides of that fight that were happening back and forth. So I don't really know what to make of this fight here. Like, Andre Lima, is he going to be smart enough to look at the last fight that Dos Santos had and actually go to shoot takedowns? So far, we haven't seen him look to wrestle all that often in his fights. In fact, based on the Mitch Raposo fight, we've seen him do nothing in his recent fights. He just kind of coasted to a win where could have had a finish and could have really put a stamp on it, but opted to leave it in the judges' scorecards. So I don't know if the fight plays out on the feet based on the output we saw from Felipe Dos Santos against Manel Kape. I don't think Andre Lima is going to be able to keep up with that kind of output. But on the other side too, if Andre Lima shoots takedowns, I don't think Felipe Dos Santos could defend them. It's a fight overall I don't have a great feel for. I'm not going to be all that invested in it either, just because there's other spots on the card that I do prefer. If I have to pick a side to play for DFS, I'm going to lean more towards the Lima side, just because if he does shoot those takedowns, we just saw Felipe Dos Santos taken down 9 times. So I have to assume there's some sort of upside there, but not a fight I'm going to be all that heavily invested in for myself. Moving on, we have here Yizha taking on Gabriel Santos. And Santos is a fighter that I'm pretty high on. So if you look at the results for Gabriel Santos, he may be 0-2, but look at some of these fights. He makes his UFC debut against Lerone Murphy. And Murphy right now is probably one of the better prospects in the division, probably one of the better unheralded prospects in the division. He's got a fight upcoming against Dan Ige. What is that? In like a month or so, something like that. And if you look at Lerone Murphy, he's somebody who also, he had the big win over, who did he win against in his last fight again? He was in the main, right, against Edson Barbosa, main event, looked career best, both in terms of output, in the striking as well as wrestling, lands 220 significant strikes, 4 takedowns. But more importantly here, this is somebody who's now a top-ranked fighter in the featherweight division who we saw Gabriel Santos have to make his debut against, and I thought that Gabriel Santos won the fight. It ended up being a very close decision. It actually was a split on the judges' scorecards. So you see that, and then Gabriel Santos, this guy could do a little bit of everything. Good wrestler, good grappler. He's also somebody who's a competent striker. He goes and fights David Onama in his second fight. He looks pretty good in the first round. It's competitive, but Santos kind of tires in the second round, ends up getting himself finished. Now you're going, and by the way, David Onama is another fighter who I have a lot of respect for, and I think he's another really solid prospect. Now I've got Gabriel Santos fighting against Yizha, and this is by far the easiest match of Gabriel Santos' career. I think he has numerous paths to win this fight. I think he could get a finish on the feet. I think he looks to wrestle. He could certainly end up getting himself a submission because I think he's a really good grappler. And also, you're not getting him as like a crazy favorite or anything like that, because there is a little bit of a discount considering he's lost his first 2 UFC fights. So I actually think you make a case that Santos should be closer to like a minus 400 favorite in this fight. And $8,800, I think that he's somebody who should be priced around like Cody Durden at $9,300 or $9,400 or something like that. So Gabriel Santos, I actually think he's a little bit of value being able to get him at $8,800. Really well-rounded fighter. I think he should be able to score big fantasy points in this matchup, especially when you consider the step down in competition for him. So Gabriel Santos, he's one of my favorite pay-up options on the slate at $8,800. Next fight here, we have Jacqueline Amorim taking on Vanessa Demopoulos. Another fight that I really don't have that much interest in. We've now got Amorim at a minus 300 favorite, which I think is a little bit of a crazy line considering we've seen some cardio issues from Amorim in the past. Her UFC debut came against Sam Hughes, and Amorim looks great in the first round. Actually nearly gets a finish in the first round. She did a rear naked choke where it looked like Sam Hughes is going to go out, but she was able to fight through it. She was able to survive. And then Amorim was just gassed. So second, third rounds, they easily go to Sam Hughes. She wins the fight 29-28. I'm pretty sure it was on every judge's scorecard. But that aside, I always have some of those concerns about Amorim's cardio because her next fight came against Montserrat Ruiz where, sure, she didn't get tired in that fight. And she gets a third round finish. But there was zero resistance. It's like, could she just stand around for 15 minutes without getting tired? Because there was zero resistance coming back from Ruiz in that fight. And then her next fight against Corey McKenna, she ends up getting a first-round finish. So we still didn't really learn much about her cardio. And that is a little bit of a concern for me in the fight against Demopoulos here, because Demopoulos is somebody who's able to keep up pace for 3 rounds. And if this fight is still going at that point, and if Amorim hasn't won the first couple of rounds, then you could see Demopoulos potentially steal a decision in the later stages of the fight. But I don't think this fight's going to score particularly well, especially because I strongly favor Amorim to win the early rounds. We do see that Demopoulos only defends takedowns at a 30% clip. So I think in the first round, probably the second round as well, pretty safe bet that Amorim is going to be able to land takedowns. So even if Demopoulos comes from behind and ends up winning the fight, I don't know if she's going to score all that well with a decision or a third round finish win, just because I don't think she's going to score very much in the first couple rounds of the fight. A lot of better fights to be targeting on the card, so I'll be looking elsewhere. I think Amorim should be able to wrestle and grapple her way to either a decision or maybe like a second round finish, but still, she's expensive, and there's a lot of high upside fighters that are highly priced that I prefer to her. So I have almost no exposure actually to either side of that fight. It's the fight that I overall have the least exposure to on the entire card. Moving on here, we have Andre Petroski taking on Dylan Budka. And I wanted to show you guys this video from weigh-ins today, because we saw Dylan Budka look terrible on the scales. You guys see here, Budka weighing in. Here's my concern with this fight. So they've said it's all good to go. It's going to happen. I don't know that I could trust Dylan Budka at all for multiple reasons here. First off, you guys could see on screen here, he looked terrible on the scales. He was shaking. Then when they finished the weigh-in, he wasn't really able to walk off by himself. He was trying to walk off the wrong side of the stage. They had to direct him the right direction. He needed assistance just being able to stay on his feet as he was shaking the entire time. So even though they've said that the fight is going to go on, he's being fined, like, what is it, 20 or 25% of his purse. How many times have we seen fights recently that fall out like 2 minutes after lock? Fight card ends up blocking, and then the first thing we hear is the announcer say, "We got bad news. The Dylan Budka fight, it isn't going to happen because he had a medical issue, passed out in the locker room," or whatever it is that they end up saying, wasn't feeling well. The Petroski against Budka fight is off. So even though this fight is expected to go forward, he looks so bad on the scales, and we've seen so many late scratches, that I'm taking that into account a little bit when I'm breaking down this fight, that I think there's a real chance this fight ends up getting scratched right after lock. Not going to say that's the most likely outcome, but it did cause me to go into our sims and do a negative ROI boost on both Petroski and Dylan Budka. I'm going to pick Petroski to win should the fight happen, because once again, like, how can we trust the physicality of Dylan Budka against a very physical fighter in Andre Petroski, who really does aggressively look to wrestle and grapple in his fights? And then you got Dylan Budka, who just looked completely drained on the scales today. And as a positive to Petroski, the knock on him in the past has been two things. The durability, which is always going to be a concern. I don't think it's as big of a concern in the matchup against Budka, and the cardio. But last fight against Josh Fremd, we saw Petroski fight a hard 3 rounds, and he looked like the fresher fighter at the end. He actually looked like he could have continued going in the fight. So I'm going to pick Petroski to win. I'm going to pick him to win by decision, but I'm terrified this fight ends up being a late scratch, and I am going to be prioritizing other payoff options over Petroski. So even should the fight go ahead, I'm going to hope that somebody like Cody Durden or Isaac Dulgarian ends up outscoring Petroski. And now finally, the first fight on the entire card, we've got Ramaska taking on Nathan Fletcher. This is a fight that was supposed to take place a couple weeks ago. So right after my birthday, the card that I didn't break down, which I'm kind of happy I didn't, because I love this fight for DFS for that card. I think I had it in like 95% of my lineups. And what ended up happening? Fight gets scratched 30 seconds after lock. We find out a medical issue on the Fletcher side, isn't able to fight, and they rebook it for this slate. It's a fight that I think should score. I thought it was going to score well a couple of weeks ago, and obviously everybody scored 0 fantasy points in the fight. But this is a striker versus grappler matchup, and these kinds of matchups generally tend to score well, because if Fletcher is able to land takedowns, I think he either gets a submission win or he gets a decision win where he's able to rack up a bunch of takedowns. And now also the fight is minus 260 to finish inside the distance. So I think a finish is the most likely outcome here. And then on the Ramaska side, he's a much better striker in the matchup, and he's big power. So if he is able to defend the takedowns of Fletcher, I think he gets himself a knockout. So whoever wins should score well. Another fight I want a lot of exposure to. I'm going to lean more towards the Fletcher side, because based on what we saw from Ramaska when he fought on The Ultimate Fighter, I don't think he's the best takedown defense. So considering Fletcher is going to be looking to wrestle and is going to be looking to hold top position, considering some of the questionable takedown defense of Ramaska, I think the most likely outcome is that Fletcher is able to land those takedowns, secure top position, and score pretty well. But fight also, I'm going to be pretty heavily exposed to. My first run of lineups here, I've got 39% exposure to Fletcher and then 37% of Ramaska. So hopefully the fight goes forward and doesn't end up getting canceled again this time. But that's going to do it for us today, guys. Did a run through of all the fights here. If you could do me a favor and you haven't done yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to sign up for our NFL package for week 1, our core package, just $1 with the promo code kickoff. Link for that down below in the YouTube description box. Good luck with the card this week, guys. See you back here next week.